Alright folks, this Saturday session is going to cover how we answer the documents-based question from our Leaving Cert History exam in the context of one of our main case studies from our Northern Ireland Politics Society topic, the Sunningdale Agreement. Before we get going into today's Saturday session, let me just take you through what you can access on ExamRevision's website. So on ExamRevision's website for Leaving Cert History and multiple subjects, we have PowerPoint tutorials, video tutorials, H1 standard notes, self-correcting quizzes, and links to all past questions that have ever came up for every single topic on the course. So if you click into each topic here, you can see the Montgomery bus boycott. We've about 10 to 15 minute long video going through that topic. We've a self-correcting quiz so students can test themselves after completing the video tutorial on the topic. You'll see there's PowerPoint presentations and also H1 standard notes for every single topic on the course. So if you'd like to head over to ExamRevision and check that out there, I definitely recommend the website for all your Leaving Cert needs, really. So our roadmap for today, we're going to break this topic down into 4 different areas. Firstly, we're going to cover the Sunningdale Agreement content. We're going to plan essentially a timeline of events for our case study. We're going to go through each event in considerable amount of detail before we link that back to the documents-based question and where this will be applicable for you guys who are sitting your Leaving Cert. Next, we're going to look at the guidelines for answering the documents-based question, how the questions are structured. I'm going to give you examples of types of questions that come up for each section within the documents-based question and how we must answer those to maximize the marks that we receive. Next, we're going to look to how to plan for a contextualization question. And these contextualization questions are often referred to as mini essays. So they're a question 4 of our documents-based question. If anyone has tuned in with me before on these Saturday sessions, they'll understand what I'm talking about here. But I'm going to show you how we plan in great detail at both macro and micro levels to really help structure our writing for, I suppose, just composing a contextualization question. And then finally, we're going to provide a sample answer, look at the positives and negatives of that sample answer, and that will be shared with you guys after you complete the feedback form at the end of the Saturday session. So before we dive straight into the content, let's have a look at where this is applicable in an exam situation. So the only time politics and society in Northern Ireland has been prescribed as the documents-based question was in 2010 and 2011. And when we look at what came up those years, in 2010, the Sunningdale Agreement, what we're going to be covering today, came up, and the Apprentice Boys of Derry came up in 2011. So if we focus in on the documents-based question or the contextualization question of 2010, it reads like this. What were the difficulties associated with implementing the Sunningdale Agreement? So we're going to provide a sample answer for that past paper as we progress throughout today's Saturday session. So the first thing we're going to do is establish a timeline of events that covers essentially, let's say, the establishment of the Sunningdale Agreement, for lack of a better word. So we'll establish this timeline of events that takes us from October 1972 with the future of Northern Ireland through the border poll, through or what was the white paper. We'll look at the significance of the assembly election, the results of that election and what that or how that dictated what was to unfold after the election. We'll look at the early discussions for this idea of power sharing in Northern Ireland. We'll look at the agreement on the power sharing executive. We'll look at the importance of white law being replaced, the Irish delegation that was put forward, the actual Sunningdale negotiations themselves before we begin this period of power sharing. And then that kind of brings us into the difficulties that I suppose are associated with the Sunningdale Agreement and the failure of the Sunningdale Agreement. So the first key event in establishing this power sharing agreement, which was the Sunningdale Agreement, is this Future of Northern Ireland document that was released by White Law. So White Law was looking for possible avenues to re-establish government in Northern Ireland following the introduction of direct rule from Westminster. So as a result of that, Whitelaw produces this document, The Future of Northern Ireland. So this is where we see the ideas of power sharing, and we see the idea of this Council of Ireland be introduced as a possibility in Northern Ireland. Following this, the border poll takes place in March 1973. So Whitelaw looks to reassure Unionists that the Union would not be broken. So he holds a referendum on the border on the 8th of March 1973. The Nationalists boycotted the poll. However, the Unionists turned out in huge numbers, and this is where we're going to see the significance of that. 57% of the electorate vote. All of those that voted resulted in 99% supporting Northern Ireland remaining in the UK. Obviously, what's important to understand there was that Nationalists boycotted the vote, so they weren't fairly or even represented at all in this border poll. However, that percentage there, 99%, shows the strength and the unity within the Unionist community as they look to uphold the union between Northern Ireland and Britain. So shortly after this border poll, Whitelaw essentially produces this paper, which became known as the White Paper. It was essentially a document called Northern Ireland's Constitutional Proposals. So this document guaranteed that Northern Ireland would remain part of the UK as long as the majority wanted to do so. And Whitelaw had essentially, I suppose, just appealed to Unionists in this regard, showing the majority wanted to remain as part of the UK, and that was always going to be the case. So this White Paper proposed a new assembly, which was just a word for Parliament, that was going to be elected by the proportional representation voting system. So the assembly would be set up by the Northern Ireland Executive, or it would set up the Northern Ireland Executive or a new Northern Ireland government, but that new government could no longer be based on one single party. So this is where we see the idea of power sharing come into play in Northern Ireland. So this executive, or this new Northern Ireland government, would deal with internal issues, so housing, healthcare, education, while London would still look after, let's say, bigger picture ideas like policing, legal system. This White Paper also introduced the idea of a Council of Ireland to be established that looked to encourage cooperation between North and South. And I'm going to highlight that Council of Ireland, as that's going to be a big sticking point for Unionists, as they seen that as, I suppose, a stepping stone for building relations towards a united Ireland. So following the introduction of this White Paper, we see the 28th of June 1973, the Assembly elections to be held. And I suppose what's important to understand here is, I suppose, just the division in Northern Ireland society at this time, the division in Northern Ireland politics, as we can see, just a split down the middle, and how this White Paper, or these White Paper proposals, split the people and the politics in Northern Ireland. So the Republicans urged Nationalists not to vote. However, the SDLP supported the proposals of the White Paper. So if we remember, the SDLP were a party who, I suppose, looked for more equality for both Catholics, or for both Unionists and Nationalists in Northern Ireland. So they're a very progressive party in that regard. So Paisley's DUP and Craig's Vanguard strongly opposed the proposals. So, you know, these were on the more extreme ends of party, while the Unionist party was divided, and that's going to become important as we get into the finer details of the Sunningdale Agreement and look at the difficulties associated with it. So Faulkner asked his members to take a pledge of support. However, this backfires as some members refuse to take it. We see a split in the Unionist party and Brian Faulkner. So let's have a look at these, or the results of this 1973 June election. So the results were disappointing for Whitelaw. As we just previously discussed, it really highlighted the divisions in Northern Ireland society. So there was a huge lack of support for the White Paper proposals among Unionists, and we can see that here, which I'm going to highlight really quickly for you. So Faulkner's section of the Unionists, or the Ulster Unionist Party, won 24 seats, while the anti-White Paper Unionists won 26 seats. So a really clear divide. My apologies. A really clear divide amongst the Unionist Party, and it almost splits that party right down the middle. So the division among nationalists not as obvious. So Sinn Féin did not take part in the election, and the SDLP was the only representation of Northern nationalism, and that SDLP party won 19 seats. We can also look to, I suppose, the cross-community parties, the Alliance Party and the NILP, who won 9 seats in that election. And what's really important here, as I've highlighted, it just showed the divisions evident in both Northern Ireland society and Northern Ireland politics. So following on from the results of this June 1973 election, we see early discussions take place as people look to, or as the Assembly looks to establish this Sunningdale Agreement. So the Assembly meets in June, and we can just see displays of bitterness on both sides. So the more extreme, the extreme unionists, the DUP and Vanguard, engage in abusive tactics against opponents, name-calling, physical attacks. However, despite this, there was a clear majority within the Assembly in favour of negotiating a settlement. However, they had 2 issues that they needed to settle beforehand. Getting both sides to agree to share power evenly. That was the basis of this power-sharing executive that was to be set up. And they had to agree on the role of the Council of Ireland, on the role the Council of Ireland should play within that. Remember, that was going to be a real sticking point for unionists moving forward. So these discussions progressed right up until October 73, when we see an agreement take place. So the talks began on the 5th of October. We see 6 unionist representatives led by Faulkner, 6 SDLP representatives led by Jerry Fitt, and we see 3 from the Alliance Party under Oliver Napier, and this meeting was chaired by Whitelaw. So all these representatives, all these people at the meeting easily agreed to set up the executive. However, they struggled to decide on how the ministerial positions would be divided amongst the party. So the final agreement was that 11 cabinet ministers would be represented by 6 unionists, 4 SDLP and 1 for the alliance parties. And there was still, I suppose, this big sticking point around these discussions was this idea of the Council of Ireland. It was accepted for now. However, however, every single person at the table, or every single party at the table, had different ideas of how, or the role that would have in this new Northern Ireland executive. So that leads us on to a key turning point in the establishment of the Sunningdale Agreement, and that's Whitelaw replaced as the Secretary for Northern Ireland. So 2 days before the second phase of negotiations begin, Whitelaw is called back to Britain by Prime Minister Edward Heath to deal with trade union strikes that were developing in Britain. So Whitelaw was seen as a respected and a valid member of Heath's government, and he felt that his experience would be better used in Northern Ireland, and that's going to cause issues when we look to this Sunningdale Agreement. So he was replaced by Francis Pym, who had very little experience in the finer details of the political situation in Northern Ireland, the nuances of the situation, for the lack of a better word. So that leads us on to this second phase of negotiations, where we're going to see the Irish delegation look to represent Ireland and look to, I suppose, establish a role for this Council of Ireland within the new power sharing executive in Northern Ireland. So this Irish government, or this Irish delegation, was led to the conference by Taoiseach Liam Cosgrave at the time. Other notable members, Foreign Minister Garret Fitzgerald, who'd go on to serve as Taoiseach of Ireland, Conor Crisler Bryan of the Labour Party. This Irish delegation initially viewed the Council of Ireland as essentially an irrelevant position. They felt it lacked any power. It didn't really have the power to establish change. However, John Hume convinced them that the council should have real power and that it could pave the way for a united Ireland. So really important for the guys there. So the 6th to the 9th of December 1973, we see this second phase of negotiations take place. So this phase of negotiations was chaired by Edward Heath, and I suppose it's just important to understand that Heath was quite sympathetic towards the SDLP at this point, the more, let's say, a more moderate party within Northern Ireland. So Faulkner and the British government hoped that the Irish government would agree to guarantee extradition of IRA members and to remove Articles 2 and 3 from the Irish Constitution in exchange for increased power in the Council of Ireland. However, the Irish government could not agree to any of those terms. They only offered a verbal commitment to more cooperation on policing, not to extradite the members of the IRA like they had hoped, and they recognised the right of Northern Ireland to remain part of the UK if the majority voted that way, but they could not agree to get rid of Articles 2 and 3 from their constitution. I suppose it's important to note there that Article 2 was the famous article from the 1937 Irish Constitution that described the island of Ireland as the national territory, essentially laying claim to Northern Ireland, even though Northern Ireland had been established under the Government of Ireland Act. So if we look to 1st of January 1974, this power sharing executive begins. Now, it did not, think about these second phase of negotiations, the roles were not so clearly defined within this power sharing executive, especially around this Council of Ireland, that was going to cause problems or difficulties further down the line. So the agreements paved the way for the establishment of a power sharing executive or government in Belfast. It took over power on the 1st of January 1974, not 47. Brian Faulkner was the chief minister. Gerry Fitt was his deputy. Represented this power sharing executive was to be represented by members from both the unionist and nationalist communities. So while the negotiations for the establishment of the Sunningdale Agreement were taking place, we could see wide-scale unionist opposition to this Sunningdale Agreement. So that all starts with the 6th of December, same date that those second phase of negotiations started, when the Orange Order, the Vanguard, the DUP and the anti-white members of the Unionist Party, so the more extreme end, or the more extreme members of the Unionist Party, formed the United Ulster Unionist Council, the UUUC. I always struggle with that one. So the aim of this UUUC was to resist power sharing and the establishment of a Council of Ireland. So after the Sunningdale Agreement is announced, the Ulster Unionist Council, which was the governing body of the Unionist Party, calls a meeting for the 4th of January. And let's just be really careful to differentiate between the two of those. So the Ulster Unionist Council was the governing body of the Unionist Party. So a motion opposing the Council of Ireland was passed 427 votes to 374 votes, and as a result of this motion, Brian Faulkner was forced to resign as leader of the Unionist Party and was replaced by Harry West. So we can see Harry West may be a little bit more on the extreme end of unionism there. As a result of this, Faulkner goes out on his own. He sets up the Unionist Party of Northern Ireland. Very confusing, I understand that. Lots of different acronyms and words here, with the remaining pro-Sunningdale supporters. So now we have the Unionist Party that was led by Harry West and more extreme unionists. And we have the Unionist Party of Northern Ireland, who was led by Brian Faulkner. They were pro-Sunningdale and looked to, I suppose, support this power-sharing executive that had been set up. So what's important to understand now is that Brian Faulkner was representing the unionist community as part of this power-sharing executive. However, he had just recently been removed as leader of the Unionist Party, as a motion opposing the Council of Ireland was passed in the Ulster Unionist Council, which was a meeting of essentially the governing body of the Unionist Party. He was removed as leader and replaced as Harry West. So now, although he's, I suppose, symbolically representing the unionist community, he wasn't the leader of the Unionist Party anymore, and there's clear divisions in that community. And we see, I suppose, people within that community resentful towards Faulkner as well. In addition to that, we're going to see two more blows to Faulkner that essentially puts the nail in his political coffin, for lack of a better word. So the first thing that we'll see pop up is issues in the south. So Kevin Boland takes a case to the Supreme Court claiming that the Sunningdale Agreement goes against the Irish Constitution. So during this court case, or during this case in the Supreme Court, the Irish government's lawyers had to make a strong case for the legitimacy of Articles 2 and 3, which laid claim to the national territory of the island of Ireland. So essentially laying claim to Northern Ireland coming under the South's control. This undermined the claim that they were symbolic as the Irish delegates discussed in the negotiation of the Sunningdale Agreement. So this was another blow to Faulkner that really kind of increased the tensions in the Unionist community. And then finally we see the British general election really just outline and highlight the lack of support within the Unionist community for Faulkner. So in 1973 we see large-scale industrial unrest in Britain, so strikes taking place. Prime Minister Heath calls a sudden general election, ignoring the pleas from Faulkner, Pym and Fitt that this would not support the consolidation of the power-sharing executive and the Sunningdale Agreement. It was still only in its infancy, it was still only in its early stage, it wasn't an established governing body of Northern Ireland yet. They felt that this general election would undermine that process, which it did. So the UUUC, so the more extreme ends of the Unionists, treats the election as a referendum on Sunningdale. So they use an infamous slogan, "Dublin is only a Sunningdale away," that becomes extremely popular and convinces the Unionist community that, or to oppose Sunningdale. So 51% of the total electorate votes for the UUUC candidates, while only 13% voted for Faulkner's party. So showing the deterioration in popularity for Faulkner. So Heath was defeated in this general election. Harold Wilson becomes Prime Minister with the Labour Party in Britain, and he just wasn't as committed to support this new Northern Ireland power sharing executive as the Conservative government as Heath were, essentially just because, you know, he didn't create this policy. This wasn't his plan, this wasn't his solution to the Northern Ireland question, so he just didn't, or he just wasn't as committed as Heath was to get this over the edge. And this all leads us up to the penultimate finale of the Sunningdale Agreement and the eventual event that actually, I suppose, takes the Sunningdale Agreement and crumbles it down into oblivion. So we look at the Ulster Workers' Council strike, and before we get into that, it's just important to highlight or acknowledge that the systematic discrimination or sectarianism that took place in Northern Ireland's employment industries meant that the majority of the workforce of important industries in the country, engineering, electricity, were almost entirely made up of Protestants, and that's going to be important when we look at the finer details of this Ulster Workers' Council strike. So the Ulster Workers' Council, the UWC, was a loyalist section of the workforce that had suggested a strike in opposition to the Sunningdale Agreement and to the introduction of the power sharing executive in Northern Ireland. So on the 15th of May, after the Assembly passes a vote of confidence in the executive, the UWC calls a strike. So loyalist paramilitary groups became involved in the strike. They established roadblocks made up of burnt out cars, buses, and sent men into factories to suggest that they close. And I've put in apostrophe or put in quotation marks there, to suggest that they close. So we see these threatening tactics used by loyalist paramilitary groups who became involved in the strike. So the strikers cut electricity output by 60% within a few days of the strike taking place, and the closure of more electricity plants meant that homes were without electricity, sewage plants were in danger of failing, and people's lives were threatened in hospitals as hospitals struggled to get enough electricity into their infrastructure. So the British Army and the RUC stood by and watched while all this took place. The British Army didn't really think that their role in Northern Ireland was to stop people from striking. They viewed their role there as to stop terrorism taking place in Northern Ireland, and it was this lack of action that resulted in the strike's success in Northern Ireland. So it was obvious in Northern Ireland that most Protestants supported the strike. The UWC actually arranged for supplies to get through the roadblocks in Protestant areas and made sure not to alienate their own people. That's really important there. We see that community looking after each other there. While this strike was taking place, there was a huge lack of government response, which enabled the Ulster Workers' Council strike to be a resounding success. So we could even make reference to Harold Wilson's speech on the 25th of May, as he essentially offends the whole population of Northern Ireland. So during this television broadcast of his speech, Harold Whittle refers to loyalists in Northern Ireland and as thugs and bullies, and this just added to the increasing difficulty associated with, I suppose, implementing the Sunningdale Agreement in Ireland, and looking to. And I'm going to get into the failures of the Sunningdale Agreement. I don't want to get into it too much now, but if we look at the failures of that Sunningdale Agreement, it's the lack of representation of all people and identities in Northern Ireland that eventually leads to this downfall. And we're going to see just the lack of, I suppose, political awareness, political understanding of the nuances of Northern Ireland and how Harold Wilson's speech contributed to increasing tensions there. Now, I went off topic there. I apologise. So, faced with hospital closures and sewage overflows, the executive, Northern Ireland Power Sharing Executive, resigned, marking the end and the failure of the Sunningdale Agreement. So it's at this point I like to stop and just think about, why did this Sunningdale Agreement fail? So we're going to outline 4 reasons why it failed. I just think it's important to understand this at this point of our studies, essentially. So firstly, the nationalists believe that Merlin Rees' reluctance to use force of the British Army and the RUC against the Ulster Workers' Council demonstrated the lack of support for their community in Northern Ireland. However, other nationalists argue that the British Army did not support the power sharing executive and they were happy to watch it fail. So once again, it comes back down to that lack of action and how that alienated certain communities in Northern Ireland. We could also look to the Labour government, as they were not enthusiastic about the power sharing executive. Like, let's think about it. I've already previously discussed this. It was introduced under a Conservative government, and the elections had proven that most Protestants in Northern Ireland did not support it. So the Labour government were not too concerned with seeing the Sunningdale Agreement and this idea of power sharing through. And then finally, not all political viewpoints in Northern Ireland were represented through Sunningdale. So this is something I just alluded to on the previous slide. So Republicans and Loyalists, the more extreme ends of society, were not represented in this power sharing executive, and this would eventually lead to the failure of the Sunningdale Agreement. And I just like to think about this here. Think about the difference between the Good Friday Agreement and Sunningdale. They were very, very similar. This idea of power sharing was clearly ingrained in both agreements. However, it was this representation of the more extreme ends of society, and how, like, Sinn Féin were represented in the Good Friday Agreement, and how that looked to, I suppose, just represent all identities in Northern Ireland, because that's what it came down to now. Okay, so guidelines for answering the documents-based question. We've covered all the content for the Sunningdale Agreement. Let's see where this fits in our exam situation. So timing is key when we're looking to answer the documents-based question, as it is with every part of our Leaving Cert History exam. Apologies. So we have 45 minutes in the exam to complete the DBQ, and there are 4 parts to a DBQ question, which I'll highlight to you now. So firstly, we have a comprehension question, a comparison question, and a criticism question. All 3 of these questions will require students to react to a source that is given to them on the exam. I'll show you what that looks like. And then finally, the one that all students kind of get their hair in a twist over is our contextualization question, or our mini essay. And we're going to look to show you how you plan a contextualization question, how many paragraphs you need to write, what paragraph structure should you take to writing this essay. And I'm going to share a sample answer with you guys to go through. So this is what your documents-based questions will look like. This is taken from 2010, the Sunningdale Agreement. And what you can see, we have our 4 different sections here. So firstly, we have our comprehension questions in number 1. They're our easiest questions. I'm going to go through that in a lot more detail now. What's really important, I'm going to highlight here in all of our first 3 questions, according to the document. Explain your answer referring to both documents. From the evidence of the documents. Give reasons for your answer. You need to refer to the documents that are given to you in every single question, and that's what I'm really going to emphasize to you guys now. And then finally, we have our contextualization question, which is a mini essay that's worth 40 marks. So our comprehension questions, pretty straightforward. Most students will achieve full marks here. We can follow a couple of keys to success to make sure that we're doing that. So while we are reading the sources, we underline the relevant parts of the extract, we give brief answers, one-line answers only. That's the biggest mistake I see students make at this point. They spend too long writing 5, 6, 7, 8 lines, and you're going to get the mark within one line as long as you make reference to that document. Then finally, our last key to success, quote the documents directly. So the types of questions that will come up here. In document A, what is meant by? What evidence does document B offer about? So really simple. Do you comprehend or understand the source that is in front of you? Secondly, we have our comparison questions. So here students are being asked to compare two accounts of the same historical event and note the similarities and differences between that. So there's maybe 4 or 5 keys to success here that will really just emphasize us picking up our full marks. Once again, I always ask students to underline, highlight parts of the text on the document that you're going to use to answer your questions. Or if it's a cartoon or a caption, I say circle or highlight key aspects of that cartoon. It's a comparison. You have to compare. You have to use both documents. And it's really important you don't just make reference to them. You compare and contrast. Document A is different to document B because blah blah blah. And then number 5, your answer will be about half a page here, so a bit more writing to do here. And there's types of questions that pop up here. How does document A differ from document B in relation to? So how does document A differ from document B in relation to the Sunningdale Agreement? You might get a document A which is making reference to a nationalist newspaper. Document B is making reference to a unionist newspaper. Which document shows the greater optimism? Discuss with reference to both documents. And then finally, type of question, how do the documents differ in their interpretation of? What I should just note, these aren't the only types of questions that can come up here. They're just examples of the types of questions that are typical for a comparison question. Number 3, we have our criticism question. So here students need to be able to recognize bias, propaganda within a source. They need to note different viewpoints, identify contradictions, make judgments about the reliability of sources. So we have 5 keys to success here. The first one I always say to students is learn notes on the strengths and weaknesses of different source types. So understand the strengths of a newspaper as a source type, but also the weaknesses of a newspaper. So the strengths of a newspaper gives us a good insight into I suppose public opinion at the time of the event. However, the weakness of the source type is that it's not an objective source type. It might contain bias, as the journalist who's writing that newspaper might be from the unionist community himself. What's important is we understand the difference between eyewitness accounts, newspaper articles, government records, diaries, letters, cartoons. They're the types of sources that we're going to see. We need to use evidence from both sources or documents in our answer. And as I've just previously kind of gave an example of there, we need to be able, these are our historical keywords. You covered them in first year. We need to be using them now. Identify objectivity, subjectivity, bias, balanced view, reliability, fact, opinion, propaganda, strengths and weaknesses, primary, secondary sources, viewpoints and perspectives. H1 level students will use those keywords in their answers there, and your answer here will be about half a page again. So examples of types of questions that will come up around this are: should a historian accept document A as a reliable source? Give reasons for your answer. What are the strengths and weaknesses of document B as a historical source? So then finally, our contextualization question, our mini essay. So now students will need to place the subject of the documents in historical context. So you won't be making reference to the documents here. You're placing it in historical context into the bigger picture at the time. So you need to show understanding of issues and events that are associated with that period. So we have 4 keys to success here. So firstly, you need to keep to the question that is asked. Recycle keywords of the question throughout your answer. You need to link every paragraph back to the question. I'm going to give you a structure to do that on the next slide. Approach your answer like a mini essay. You're going to have an intro and a conclusion, and then 5 main paragraphs. So your intro and conclusion are going to be extremely short, and you're going to have 5 main paragraphs. in order to pick up the most available marks and maximize our marks here. If you'd like more detail into why we do this, I'd suggest go back and watch one of my previous Saturday sessions. I look at approaches to Leaving Cert essay writing, where you'll get a detailed breakdown of why we write this many paragraphs in each essay and how that helps us maximize our marks. Finally, for our mini essays, you need to keep the introduction and conclusion short. Use connective words throughout and link the paragraphs back to the questions. I'm going to give you what I call like a historical formula like we'd use in maths now to ensure we're structuring our paragraphs in the right way to help us achieve these keys to success. So the types of questions that would come up here, like if we look at the Coleraine University as an example, why did the decision to establish a university at Coleraine provoke controversy? To what extent did the decision to locate a second university in the city of Coleraine show evidence of the deliberate neglect of the city of Derry by the Unionist government? So that's obviously taken from our case study, the Coleraine University controversy. Mini essay style questions, I think they're really nice to answer, to be honest. So in order to structure our essays in our paragraphs within our essay in the correct fashion that allows us to maximize our marks and that I suppose just puts our best foot forward when we think about good historical writing, I ask my students to follow this Peel approach to the paragraph. So I sell this as like a historical formula for writing essays. So we're going to go through what this Peel approach is, give you phrases that you can use within your essay. Then we're going to plan a mini essay contextualization question, and we'll go through a sample answer here. When we go through my sample answer, please look out for and try to notice the use of my Peel approach within each paragraph. It really helps structure my paragraphs in a way that brings my essays forward and really just allows me to maximize my marks. So in order to follow a Peel approach in our paragraphs, first thing we need to do is make a point, then provide evidence, explain that evidence, and then link our paragraph back to the question. So now I'm going to share phrases with you that allows you to do that as a student. So in order to make your point, some phrases that you could use. Now these are phrases that you could use. They don't have to be used. You can follow this Peel approach without using these phrases. If we're only starting to, I suppose, tackle this Peel approach, I'd suggest using phrases like this to help structure. So firstly, you could say, it can be argued that. Historians have argued. The sources suggest. We can infer. To provide evidence in your paragraph, or what they'd be called, you go into college, you look at historical essay writing, connective words or linking words. So there's two types of linking words or words to help provide evidence. We've ones to join ideas, firstly, secondly, in addition, furthermore, moreover, or words, connective words, linking words to help us change ideas. However, conversely, on the other hand, alternatively, but after we provide evidence, we have to explain that evidence. This means that, therefore, consequently, as a result, because of this, and then after we explain our evidence within our paragraphs, we have to link it back to the question that is being asked, showing the examiner, look at me, I'm answering the question. We can therefore see from the evidence, it is clear that the Sunningdale Agreement failed as a result of several difficulties associated with embedding the agreement in Northern Ireland society, as an example of that. The most important factor here is in conclusion. So that leads us up into how do we plan for these mini essays? So we plan for them just like we would our main essays for our Leaving Cert history exam. Once again, I'm going to plug that video that Saturday session I done a couple of weeks ago on the 11th of November, I think it was. It was strategies to improve essay writing for Leaving Cert students. Really useful Saturday session for you to go back and watch and gain a lot of understanding into, I suppose, constructing an essay in order to maximize your marks as a student. However, when I'm planning or when I'm asking my students to plan for essays, we plan at two different levels, macro and micro. So macro is from like a bigger picture. We're looking at I suppose just the big details of the essay. We go through what's the main topic of each paragraph. Micro essay, I want a much finer plan. I'm going to go through both here. So we're going to look to plan for our contextualization question. What were the difficulties associated with implementing the Sunningdale Agreement, which was the last time this came up 11 years ago? It only had the chance to come up twice and it came up. So the first thing we're going to do is write a short intro. Paragraph 1 is going to be about the initial response in unionist and nationalist communities in Northern Ireland. Paragraph 2 is going to be the first meeting of the Northern Ireland Assembly, the 22nd of January. Paragraph 3 is going to be the UK general election in February, how that was a difficulty associated. Really key word there, maybe I should have highlighted that. This is going to be the word that I'm linking back to in every sentence. I'm almost going to be overdoing this to the examiner. Look at me talking about the difficulties associated with this. Next, we'll look at the Ulster Workers' Council strike, May 1974, and then we'll look at the response to the Ulster Workers' Council strike and how this provided difficulty in implementing the Sunningdale Agreement. And then finally, we're going to conclude our essay. Okay, so guys, macro plan for this. You're going to see this covered in immense detail. And this is a skill that I will get my students, or I'll build my students up to be able to create these macro plans by themselves. So we're planning for each essay at both macro and micro levels, and it makes our essays more adaptable to different types of question because we can take paragraphs out of essays and move them around and stuff. Anyway, we won't get too much into the details there. I probably won't go through every step of this macro plan because I want to actually share with you my sample essay rather than get bogged down by the plan, but I'll go through the first 3 paragraphs here and show you the detail that I'm including. So for my intro, I'm looking to include a quote to introduce the essay and demonstrate evidence of outside reading. That's how we push up our OE mark here. Once again, if you want more detail about that, go watch our exam revisions strategies to improve essay writing. I go through how we improve our OE mark here. So OE and CM is how we are marked on our essays. You need to react to the essay question, state the main argument of your essay, and explain the approach of your essay. So an example I always say to my students, we're not going to pick up good marks in our introduction anyway. We just generally don't. So what we do is we keep our introduction short. So we just outline the approach. Firstly, this essay will discuss the responses in both unionist and national communities to the Sunningdale Agreement. Secondly, this essay will outline the difficulties caused by the meeting of the Ulster Unionist Council on the 4th of January. And blah, 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 etc. We get that. So paragraph 1, we're looking to discuss the initial response in the unionist and nationalist communities. Now look at the detail that I'm giving here for myself while I plan. So first thing I need to do is state where a rally was held for unionists to demonstrate their opposition to power sharing. Second thing I need to do is describe what unionist organisations came together to form the United Ulster Unionist Council. Third thing I need to do is outline what the United Ulster Unionist Council intended to do. Fourth thing I need to do is explain the majority responses to the Sunningdale Agreement in nationalist communities. Then 5, I need to outline Sinn Féin and the IRA's reaction to the Sunningdale Agreement. So now when I go to write that paragraph in that essay, I have my 5 points that I need to do, and I'm going to use my Peel paragraph approach to help structure that paragraph in a more coherent way and help me maximize my marks there. So let's have a look at paragraph 2, and I won't go through the other details with you. So paragraph 2 is, okay, my macro plan. I need to discuss the first meeting of the Northern Ireland Assembly on the 22nd of January and the difficulties that were associated with that. Let's highlight that word again. I probably should have done that earlier in this PowerPoint slide. So the first thing I need to do in this paragraph is describe the structure of the power sharing executive. Secondly, I need to outline what they had hoped to achieve. Thirdly, I need to explain why their first meeting descended into chaos. Fourthly, I need to state 3 activities that anti-agreement assembly members undertook on the day. Fifth thing I need to do is how many police officers were hurt in the event. Sixth thing I need to do is describe the symbolic nature of this event regarding the difficulties in implementing the Sunningdale Agreement. Really important. Link that back to the question. So the rest of my macro plan looks like this. When we're writing a conclusion, we look to do these 3 things. Restate the main ideas of your essay. When one considers the initial response in unionist and nationalist communities to the Sunningdale Agreement, we have to answer the so what. So explain why any of this matters, why the reader should care. Remember, your conclusion is the last thing an examiner will read from your essay. Why was it important that they read this? And then I like to say to my students, include like a kicker or a lingering thought. So your last sentence should leave the reader nodding in agreement and feeling glad that they bothered to read your essay. So if you stick a famous, or if you're stuck here, I always just say stick a famous quote in that connects your ideas in the previous sentences. So let's have a look at a sample essay now. So as I read through my sample answer here, this will be shared with everyone who completes the feedback at the end of the Saturday session. What I want you to pay attention to is the peel paragraph structure I use in my paragraphs, how that structures my paragraphs in a way that allows me to maximize the marks that I'm going to achieve. So this is my introduction. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to start this with a quote to help demonstrate evidence of outside reading, push my OE mark up. So the real division of Ireland is not a line drawn on the map, but in the minds and hearts of its people. John Hume. So this essay will develop Hume's idea that the Irish people are divided not by lines on a map, but by their own mentality, by exploring the difficulties associated with implementing the Sunningdale Agreement in Northern Ireland. Know how I'm using the keyword from the question in the first line when I state my point. At first, the Sunningdale Agreement was seen as a breakthrough in resolving the conflict in Northern Ireland. However, the attempt at power sharing would eventually symbolise the increasing division between Unionist and Nationalist communities in Northern Ireland. This essay will discuss the difficulties associated with implementing the Sunningdale Agreement by outlining initial response to the agreement in Unionist and Nationalist communities. Secondly, by highlighting the significance of the UK's 1974 general election in the eventual failing of the power sharing executive. Finally, by discussing the importance of the Ulster Workers' Council strike regarding the mobilisation of Unionists against the implementation of the agreement in Northern Ireland. So what I've just done there is explain the approach of my essay. I've stated my main argument. I've demonstrated evidence of outside reading. So now this is my first paragraph. Please pay attention to the peel structure approach I use, how that structures my paragraph in a very coherent way. So it can be argued that initial response to the Sunningdale Agreement in Unionist and Nationalist communities gave an insight into how people would react to its implementation. Firstly, while the conference at Sunningdale was still ongoing, a rally was held at the Ulster Hall on 6th of December 1973, which was attended by Unionists opposed to the idea of power sharing. At the rally, the TUP leader Ian Paisley, the leader of the Vanguard movement, and some members of the Orange Order decided to come together to form the United Ulster Unionist Council. They decided that they would work together to oppose the implementation of the Sunningdale Agreement. Conversely, I'm changing ideas, the Sunningdale Agreement was broadly welcomed by the nationalist community. They felt the executive would give nationalists a say in governance, and the Council of Ireland was seen as a step in the right direction towards a united Ireland. Alternatively, the agreement was opposed by the IRA and Sinn Féin, as they felt the Council of Ireland reinforced the idea of partition on the island. The IRA went as far as carrying out a series of bombings in London in response to the agreement. From the evidence, it is clear that by looking at the extreme responses evident from both communities, there would be serious difficulties, keyword from the question, in the implementation of the Sunningdale Agreement in Northern Ireland. Really following a very structured approach, using my connective words, making my first point, linking it in my last sentence. Paragraph number 2, the first meeting of the Northern Ireland Assembly. So historians have argued the symbolic nature of the first meeting of the Northern Ireland Assembly as a sign that demonstrated the large-scale difficulties. Once again, I'm being very obvious to the examiner. Look at me, I'm answering the question that you're asking me, associated with implementing the Sunningdale Agreement. The power sharing executive was to be constructed with Faulkner as the chief executive, Fitt as the deputy chief executive, and ministers from the Unionist Party, SDLP and Alliance parties making up the rest. The group were initially optimistic for reconciliation, however the events that would follow would greatly weaken its authority. The first meeting of the executive on the 22nd of January descended into chaos when Ian Paisley and his anti-agreement assembly members violently seized occupation of ministerial seats and had to be forcibly removed from the chamber. In addition, one member of the Vanguard movement chained himself to one of the chairs, and 8 RUC men had to carry Ian Paisley out to the front steps. Furthermore, 5 RUC police officers were injured as they tried to restore order. We can therefore see that the chaotic nature in which the power sharing executive started would symbolise the difficulties that they would experience implementing the Sunningdale Agreement. making reference, linking my paragraph back to the question. Look, examiner, I'm answering the question that's being asked. Very obvious about it. I've used difficulty twice in that paragraph, and you can see my connective words throughout as well. So paragraph 3, we look at the UK general election. So let's follow along again, looking out for that structured approach. The historical evidence suggests that the UK general election of February 1974 would further add to the difficulty of the power-sharing executive in their implementation of the Sunningdale Agreement. Firstly, Edward Heath called a general election for February 1974 that would further weaken the authority of the power-sharing executive. Consequently, of the 12 minister seats for Northern Ireland constituencies, Unionist candidates opposed to the Sunningdale Agreement won 11 seats, while the remaining seats went to the SDLP. The popular slogan, "Dublin is just as Sunningdale away," became popular over the campaign as it helped to persuade Unionist voters that the agreement was a step in the direction of Irish unity. So I'm really explaining my points here, or my evidence here. As a result of the general election, it became evident that large portions of the population in Northern Ireland, especially amongst Unionist communities, outright rejected the power-sharing institutions established in the country. Furthermore, the Labour Party won the most seats in the election, and Harold Wilson became Prime Minister and appointed Merlin Rees as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. This was significant as Wilson and Rees were not as committed to support the Northern Ireland executive as Conservatives, because it was not their policy to try and implement the Sunningdale Agreement. We can therefore infer that the UK general election of 1974 added greatly to the difficulties faced by the Northern Ireland power-sharing executive in trying to implement the Sunningdale Agreement. Once again, you can see the word difficulty twice. When I'm making my first point, then I provide evidence, I explain my evidence, and I link it back to the question that's been asked. Okay, I'm going to read one more paragraph here because I don't want to bore you guys to death just sitting here reading through an essay. I can feel that you're getting the point here. You can see the Peel approach in being applied in a practical way. You can see how that's guiding my paragraphs towards picking up the most marks that I possibly can. You can also see how important the macro plan and the micro plan is in achieving or just optimizing the marks that we can pick up. So let's go through this one more, looking out for our Peel approach. So it can be argued that the biggest difficulty, it's so obvious it's almost comical, associated with implementing the Sunningdale Agreement in Northern Ireland came in the form of the Ulster Workers' Council strike. The UWC was an organisation of loyalist workers drawn from traditionally Protestant industries, such as shipbuilding and electricity supply, that formed in 1969. The UWC announced a strike that would take place on the 15th of May following the defeat of a vote calling for the rejection of the Sunningdale Agreement. On the morning of Wednesday, 15th of May, support for the UWC strike was limited. It was reported that 90% of the Chamber of Commerce in Belfast workforce turned up for work. However, the situation changed when the UDA, a loyalist organisation, became involved and began to enforce the implementation of the strike. The UDA began to implement tactics such as abusing workers as they walked to factories, hijacking buses to stop workers from going to their jobs, and threatening employers that their buildings would be bombed if they remained open. Additionally, the most important tactic used over the course of the strike was the occupation of power stations by loyalists. This resulted in a reduction of electricity generation by 60% of the normal supply, forcing many factories to shut down. Furthermore, surrounding areas experienced power blackouts daily as the situation became critical for local hospitals. We can therefore see the significance of the UWC strike as a major difficulty associated with implementing the Sunningdale Agreement. Now, I'm not going to go through any more paragraphs in that amount of detail. As I said, I don't want to bore you to death just reading out paragraphs. Hopefully you can see how we're practically applying the theory and the formula and the structure that we're looking to do to optimize our marks there. So I'll just skip through the slide there so you can see it in a little bit more detail. So this is paragraph 5. It's looking at responses to the UWC strike. So before I leave you go, guys, I just want to highlight one more time what's available on ExamRevision's website. So we have video tutorials, PowerPoints, H1 standard notes, and my favorite tool located on the website that I use so much with my own students is the self-correcting quizzes that allows students to check their own understanding of topics as they progress through them. So once again, you'll see me click into the Montgomery bus boycott here, We have a video tutorial, covers the topic in huge detail, 10 to 15 minutes at most. And then you're going to see our self-correcting quiz there to help solidify that information for you guys. I'm going to leave it there, guys. Thanks so much for tuning into this Saturday session. I'm looking forward to working more with you guys in the future. And don't forget that you can sign up to ExamRevision